Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our closing plenary for the Thematic series that have been working on over the last 3 weeks. My name is Christy Urich. I am a program manager with World Vision United States, and I'm a member of the steering group for the Clean Fed and Nurtured Coalition, which is a co-host of this webinar series, which is also hosted by PRO-WASH and WASHPaLS. We're very happy that you are here today and also for your participation in the past 3 thematic discussions we've had. I'm going to take a few moments just to open us up, and then we'll get started into the nitty-gritty of today. So just to recap, what is the purpose of this thematic discussion series? Why have we been here? Why are we doing this? And just as a reminder, this was a follow-up from a webinar series we had last year, which I'm sure to many of us feels like 5 years ago, on enteric infection, child growth, and pathways of exposure. That series is focused on exploring evidence, lessons from pilot interventions, and looking at indicators. So in this particular discussion, we want to sort of recap those conversations, update each other on anything new, and discuss a way forward. So really, how do we take these key areas of evidence, interventions, and indicators, and move that conversation forward? So the key questions we've been exploring during this series have been how implementers can apply best practice when research isn't inclusive. What role implementers can play in both monitoring, documenting, or contributing to the evidence base. How can researchers be most responsive to needs in the field? And how are we any closer to defining what we mean by transformational WASH, or provide guidance for standalone or integrated WASH? So the 3 discussions, they commenced on March 24th and occurred about a week. Through last week. So the first conversation focused on the integration and measurement of early childhood development within WASH programs. It was a really interesting and productive conversation led by Dr. Maureen Black and Victoria Sargsyan. March 31st, the discussion focused on interventions along the behavior change spectrum to reduce animal and human fecal pathways. And that was led by James Tidwell, or Ben Tidwell, as I know him, and Julie Baum. And April 7th was last week, focusing on rethinking the environment. So focusing on practical ways to rethink agriculture and animal husbandry. And that was led by Alojeli and Nicole. I'm going to say her last name wrong. And then we are here today with all of us coming back together to discuss the learnings and outcomes of those conversations. So our main goals today, as I mentioned, we're going to review what we discussed in those 3 sessions. We're also hoping to present a draft list of recommendations and get your feedback. So be prepared to not only listen, but participate and engage. So keep notes of your comments and thoughts as we share them, and be ready to share, discuss. And then also we'll take a little bit of time at the end to talk about who the key stakeholders are that we would want to know about these recommendations and use them and to carry them forward. So keep that in mind, because we will want your input on that at the end of this conversation. So for now, I'll hand over to my colleague, Peter Hines from World Vision, who will start the discussion recap on the ECD discussion. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Christy, so much, and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I see some of our colleagues on as well, and so it's from 5 a.m. where Christy is all the way to 3, 4, 5 p.m. Where some of you are. So thank you all for being here. So yes, the first conversation was held 4 weeks ago now, in the middle of March. And so we talked about that ECD and WASH integration. And so specifically, some of the things that conversation did talk about were that even though this age range is 0 to 5, 0 to 8, depending on who's defining early childhood education. The actual interventions that might be prioritized for those age groups are really wide and diverse. And so for that delivery period at the health facility or at home, we're really talking about 6 cleans and hygienic delivery. If we're talking about that 0 to 3 age range, there's lots of home visiting programs for wash behavior change and potentially for like prenatal and postnatal care visits. And so how do we try our best to integrate messages in that age frame that if we already have people going to the household to provide messages around hand washing or building latrines, can we actually also put into those early childhood positive parenting messages? And then we really saw at this 3 to 5 or even older than that age range, this is where students start to go to ECE centers or maybe starts to end up in primary schools. And so thinking about what is the architecture infrastructure at those centers, how can we be sure that play is done well, but that involves hygienic natures of hygienic toys and places for hand washing and latrines and all of those key concepts. And so we tossed those ideas around a little bit in the group. One of the things that came out as well was around the fact that high contact interventions is likely needed to see behavior change. And so we did, as we all have done often, talked a bit about the SHINE trials and WASH benefit trials. And one of the things that came out of that was the need for frequent messages at the household level. And so we talked about, could we think about different technologies or different programming styles that really had high frequency of contact interaction. And then the last thing that we did talk about, which for those of you who have been around Clean Fed and Nurtured or Pro-Wash or WASHPaLS for a while, we talk about this a lot, is the programming silos. And so often we're implementing a WASH project, or we're implementing an ECE project, or we're implementing a health nutrition project, and there the three shall meet. And so how do we continue to break down those silos, think about integrated monitoring? And so we had a really robust conversation around that. The recording is posted on the Clean Fed and Nurtured website. But when we get to the recommendations just a little bit, you'll see how those bleed into the key recommendations we have. So that was 3 weeks ago, 3 to 4 weeks ago, depending on how you're counting. And then the week after that, we moved into conversation 2. So I will hand it over to Julia to recap conversation 2.
That's great, Peter. Thanks so much. And that sets a good stage. There was some continuity, of course, from one discussion to the other. So the second discussion used as a starting point, we reviewed some of the infant-specific risks, the neglected sources and pathways that are affecting the growth and overall development of infants and young children. And we discussed that given limited evidence to guide our best practice, how can sectors then sort of move forward in a evidence-y, responsible way, in a coordinated way. And then in addition, we also focused on how implementers and researchers might work together to best define best practice and to discard some of the less effective measures that have been surfacing. Following the dissemination, as Peter was starting, but following the dissemination of the WASHB and SHINE RCTs, and then some of the ensuing commentaries, there was a call for transformational WASH. And if you could go to the next slide. So what we did in the discussion as well is we then reviewed, okay, given that more traditional WASH will not even start to address those infant-specific pathways, what are the options before us? And we reviewed those in the session. And in doing that, we also noted that these behavioral-focused or the behavior-focused responses fall onto a spectrum. And starting on the right, without any kind of ranking, there were some interventions that are really sort of classic BCC, communication message-oriented, that really could potentially have biological and behavioral plausibility. And so some of the messaging that you see on the right, there's the M Health, which had shown some real promise. The most extreme might be something like breastfeeding promotion or some of the food hygiene, where through BCC, behavior can be changed. So moving towards the left, some of the other interventions involved what we call enabling technologies. So we reviewed some of the evidence around playpens, which WASHPaLS has done an inquiry over the past 2 or 3 years. And then through our grants program, we've been looking at things like improving safe disposal of infant feces, things that, again, require a technology, a product, and also a behavioral push, a behavioral promotion, demand creation. So that's sort of in the middle, enabling technologies with some BCC. And then all the way to the left on your screen are the technologies that we call choice architecture. You change the environment, and then it guides the path for the new improved practice without much promotion or even necessarily mindful thoughts on the part of the target, on the part of the household. And that sort of far end would be improved flooring. So we went through not only the particulars of these and what we know, but then also started thinking from a behavioral lens. What are some of those implications on changing practice? Next slide, please. And then we ended the second session really looking, given that there is still a huge gap in the evidence base, what forms could implementer and researchers, what kinds of partnerships might help to move us forward in all sense of the word. And no details now, but we looked at that different nature of partnerships. And Ben spent quite a bit of time looking at, well, what can we do besides sort of baseline end-line surveys and RCTs to really contribute to that evidence base? So that's a rapid summary of our second session, and we can then discuss the specific recommendations that flowed from that when we get to that point in the discussion. Thanks so much. I'll turn it over now to Wilbert.
Thank you. Well, I'll do the recap for our discussion on April 7th on rethinking the microenvironment and practical ways to rethink agriculture and animal husbandry. During this session, we had 2 presentations from Dr. Aulo Yeli from IFPRI, who presented on, his presentation was focused on the pathways linking agriculture, livestock, and nutrition and child development. And then we had a presentation from Nicole Kogianesi from Food for the Hungry, and her presentation was focused more on baby wash and the work that they have been doing in DRC to identify exposure pathways to fecal pathogens for children and develop scalable interventions to reduce fecal contamination from these pathways. And some of the interventions that she highlighted were some of the ones that that Julia just mentioned earlier, like the improved flooring, but then also the playpens and or petting animals. Afterwards, we had 2 breakout rooms, and one was focused on agriculture and nutrition, and the other was focused on animal husbandry. And from these discussions, we had a few key takeaways that I have highlighted here. And from the agriculture group, one of the key takeaways was to track or measure additional child well-being outcomes. The group discussed how if we only measure stunting, we might be setting ourselves up to fail because there are a lot of other well-being outcomes that we might not be tracking. However, we don't know what those indicators could be, so there's a need to do more research or come to an agreement on what those child well-being indicators could be. Then another thing that came up was the need to integrate or layer activities from different sectors, so that you're not doing those silo programming like Peter was mentioning earlier. And from the animal husbandry group, we discussed a lot of the risks and benefits of animal raising and how that's also context specific and how projects need to really think about the local context and take a human-centered approach in order to design activities that are that fit the local environment, but also that are welcomed by the community. And there was a lot of discussion that we had about how we also need to make sure that any activity that involves animal raising or animal husbandry, we need to focus a lot as we see on the health and awareness to complement those activities to make sure that by promoting, for example, animal penning, we're not putting children at risk, since many times or often children are the ones that will be cleaning out that animal pen and removing the feces. So if we are not careful, we could be exposing children to much higher pathogen loads. Um, and then we also discussed the relative risk, or the need to do like more research on the relative risk of animal feces harm to children. And some of the discussion revolved around, like, are there any type of animal feces that is riskier than others, and how we can mitigate that, and how our activities can be designed to make sure that we're not exposing children to more harm by promoting those activities. And then we'll discuss some of the other, or go more into details on the recommendations from this group later on in the group. Thank you.
Great. So now we'll jump into the recommendations here. And so just a really big thank you to all of our speakers from those 3 conversations, and all of you who came and gave your thoughts. That really has brought us to where we are today for the recommendations. So what we've done here, and what we're planning to do, is we've broken up our recommendations into 3 different categories: around implementation, around advocacy, and around monitoring and research. And so what we'll do first is I'll take us through all 3 of those categories of recommendations. And then I do want to pause just for anyone to give initial reactions and high-level comments to the recommendations as a whole. And so we'll pause for, 4 or 5 minutes just to hear initial thoughts. And then we actually do want to break out into groups to wrestle through each of the categories in a bit more detail. And so if you're more interested or have more thoughts on the implementation or advocacy or monitoring and research recommendations, please do join that group. They'll be small but mighty, and we'll wrestle through things that need to change or be added or deleted. We'll come back and share those, and then end thinking about what's next and who might use these recommendations. So for our implementation recommendations, the first one here is thinking about what is the actual thing that we're measuring. So we've talked for a long time about stunting, and that is an important measure. We're not saying that we should drop that, but program implementers should think about what other things are we supposed to be measuring, or should we be measuring along the pathway to stunting that can show some impact on child well-being or specific program outputs. That's really key for these multi-sectoral programs. Next here is that we need to continue as a community here, and involving our colleagues, to really create guidance for multi-sectoral programming. And so really bringing in the hygienic wash lens, or the ECE lens, the nutrition lens, to multiple projects, as we know that during these early years, all of these sectors are really important. That's what Clean Fed Nurtured and these other coalitions are founded on, as these, 3-legged stool of importance of these sectors. And so then the third bullet there is that we should focus on messages that highlight emotional drivers. Especially during the ECT conversation, we talked about how messages that are attractive to caregivers and they feel good about doing them, or feel like their family is better off because they have done them, are really important. Or in the agriculture conversation, animal husbandry conversation, we talked about if you're using animal feces for fertilizer, that actually has an economic driver piece to it, as well as a health protective piece to it. So how can we bring out these multiple different benefits of messages that we know are going to be helpful from an implementation standpoint? These last 2 points here really are about the how of these messages for implementers. And so the first one is, we talked about not being too overly ambitious in year 1. If you're starting up a new program, there's lots of things about hiring personnel and getting your baselines done and really beginning to have some forward momentum. And if we're too ambitious of trying to put all of these programs together into one, have a really strong integrated nature from the very beginning, or just, a full WASH, full ECE, full nutrition project, it can get a bit overwhelming and it might not be as successful as hoped. And so what is the key integrated message or 2 that we can focus on in year 1? And then after we show some success, to expand from there is key. And lastly, how can we use new tools to up that frequency of messaging? So using SMS or other technologies that are much more prominent now, both in programming and in the communities where we work, but not to allow those messages to just become noise, right? We don't want to just bombard people with text after text. We want to make sure that they are beneficial and connect back to that third point there around emotional drivers for key messages. So that's what we came up for implementers. Next, we came up for a list of recommendations for advocacy folks. So some of us on the call focus more on the advocacy nature. And so the first point here is to actually think around transformational growth and development. And so this concept of transformational WASH has come out more strongly, as Julia was saying, after the Shine and WASHB and those commentaries, but that still is pretty WASH focused. We actually recommend bringing that, or consider bringing that up to a higher level of transformational growth and development, which encompasses WASH aspects and hygienic aspects for sure, but positive parenting, caregiving, nutrition, all of those key aspects that we know are key in the early years. The second point here is really what they talked about in group 2 around the behavioral changes around architectural type interventions. So whether that be improved flooring or caging and penning of animals, these kinds of things can help protect the environment. And while they may be we just need to figure out if they have promise, and then figure out if they are really successful, how we would finance those down the road. So we want to continue to push forward with these architectural change type interventions and advocate for people to test the impact of these projects. And lastly, the last point here is to always have a lens for the caretaker. So often when we talk about multi-sectoral programming, the problem is that we put all of our messages onto the head of household, which is often the female caretaker, and they have to do everything. And that is not fair to her, nor is it helpful for the overall health outcomes that we're after. And so to make sure that the rights of those caretakers and the mental health of those women are at the center of all of our programming decisions, or is center in funding decisions, is really key and something that we want to carry forward from these conversations. So lastly, in our recommendations, we did talk about monitoring and research and what are those key things that we're looking at. And so there's a number of things here. The first is minimum standards for WASH infrastructure, safety, security, teaching and learning at ECE centers. So in that first conversation, we talked about ECE centers being a really good entry point for multi-sectoral programming, but what are the standards? We need some research and checklists around what those standards should be. We also talked during the third conversation about relative risk rankings for animal feces. And so is it chicken feces? Is it cow and goat feces? What is the most harmful? Is there a ranking? And therefore, should we program to impact those pathways more than others? I think that's an open question that we still would like to push to get answers on to help our programming. Third is, what are the indicators other than stunting? So we talked about this in the implementation recommendations, but what are those other indicators that we would want to measure? And are there a subset of those that we would encourage all programs that are multi-sectoral to implement, so we can kind of compare and contrast across multiple programs? Fourth is testing the efficacy of these transformational products. So we saw in the last slide, architectural type interventions. A lot of those are going to be very expensive, or more expensive than the populations that we're working with can afford. We still believe that those should have research and be able to start to show if they provide that transformational growth and development. If they do, then I think the funding conversation is a different one. How do we fund this, and how do we make sure this is available to all? That should not limit our testing and feasibility of these interventions themselves. And so you'll see that last point is exploring those financing considerations and what are the methods we would want to use those for. So those are our high-level thoughts that came out of these three conversations. Like I say, we will break into groups shortly to dive into each one of those in more detail. But we did want to pause here. Just now that you've seen those have been reflected back from the conversations you have. Does anyone have some high-level comments on, yes, that sounds good, or this feels like a piece that's missing? Would love to hear anyone's thoughts. Yes, Janita, I see your hand first. Go ahead. Brave soul first. Oop, I don't hear you. Are you mute still, maybe? There, now I hear you. Go ahead.
You hear me?
I do. Oop. I've lost you again. Is that just me?
Oh, it sounds like there's a connection.
No, it's me too.
Oh.
Maybe someone else while she adjusts.
Janita, we see you're talking, but we don't hear you still because of a connection issue. Oh. All right. Well, she'll hopefully hear us in a minute. In the meantime, other comments?
Janita, not sure if you're seeing this. If you want to write in the chat, I can see your voice. It seems like there's a sound problem there.
I'm sending her a chat now, so hopefully she'll see.
Anyone else wanting to jump in while we don't have to have airtime? Peter, why don't you move on then? It seems like, oh, her hand's still up, but I'm not sure. Why don't we move on? Yeah.
We can't hear Gina, unfortunately.
This is
Oscar, go ahead, please.
Yes. I'm looking at the recommendations, and thank you very much for allowing us to be part of this session. I have a question around the third bullet. No, the second bullet under implementation recommendations, which spoke about programming guidance is needed to facilitate multi-sectoral integration given there are few existing resources for best practice. What would be the recommendation here in the sense that we are not laying this assignment at anyone's door? Is it something that you're thinking of working around as a group of actors, or how do you intend to go about this? And then again, the question around focusing on using each sector's lens. Does that run counter to the attempts to move away from siloed integration, or are we adopting the kind of approach that speaks to planning jointly, implementing by sector, and monitoring jointly? I'd just like a little bit of clarity on that second bullet. Thank you, and over.
Peter, if you'll allow, I'll just give a quick response, and then I know we want to move into the breakout groups. This is Julia speaking. When we were talking about program guidance, a number of the sort of major agencies, WHO, UNICEF, USAID, Action Against Hunger, have already come out with some guidance and saying in this, it's not a vacuum of evidence-based, but it's when there still isn't sort of a clear path forward of best practice. They have come out with, in the meantime, and for instance, would be to sort of target nutrition hotspots with integrated efforts, but using data available, look to put in community-wide water sanitation, but in an area where you have persistent stunting, as a for instance. So some of it would be a dissemination function that we're suggesting is just to make what's out there more and widely available. I think your point about the sector lens, we might want to tinker with this language some, but the idea is always that when doing advocacy, when doing implementation, you want to present things in a way that is appealing and makes it easy for each of those stakeholders and donors to act. And so, if you will, sort of you'd want to present different arguments for the WASH lens of from each sector lens of how do you do this? So what are sort of small doable actions if you're in a WASH activity? You know, how can you incorporate child development focus and indicators into it? So that's what we mean by from that sector lens of how to then be more multi-sectoral and layer that into the programming, into the approach. And some of it would certainly require that group multi-sectoral planning, but to try and make the actions small doable actions as we talk about them for each sector to be more integrated and layered. So it's maybe entering a few more indicators and a smaller focus on some of the other sectors to start. I know that's not a thorough answer, but it's an initial response. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Julia. Good, and we can talk more about this when we break up. We just want to come back to Janita really quickly. She's changed her audio, so we'll see if it's working now.
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me now?
We can now. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Janita. You were having comments earlier, and you looked like they were so good, and we could see you talking, but we couldn't hear you, unfortunately.
I couldn't. I stopped hearing you for whatever reason as well. I could hear you perfectly fine, but yeah, it was weird. So yeah, all my comments, all my passionate comments. So just briefly, I really like. I think you did a great summary, and it was a great discussion over the last couple of webinars, although I wasn't able to join everyone. I really liked what Julia presented on the sort of the spectrum between sort of messages and products, though I do, inside me it cringes a little bit when I hear the language the language around message delivery, because I don't think any behavior change is just message delivery, because message delivery really then means you tell someone what to do and expect that person to do that, and if they don't do, well, then you keep telling them. While what I'm missing in this mix is a little bit the service delivery and the enabling environment, sort of a little bit that socio-ecological model that we're using in social and behavior change, where even if it's a simple, what we just talk about, something like breastfeeding, the word simple just kept stuck in my mouth, because I think everyone who had a child or has been someone around who has been breastfeeding knows it's mighty hard. And it takes a whole support service, because there are insecurities, there are it's a whole hoist of what do I eat, what do I do when the child cries, what do I do if I don't have enough milk, what do I, and all of these things like should be part of a larger support system that in a lot of contexts exists. So I don't think that the message delivery is necessarily a language that Julia just said breastfeeding is not a simple intervention. It doesn't require.
And please keep going. My point being, when I put that on the spectrum,
it doesn't require products, and I would say, yeah, and I agree with that. It doesn't require products, but it does require services, and sort of a support.
And laws and policies too, about taking breaks if you're working and those sorts of things. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I think moving away from this message delivery to looking at behavior change in sort of on all its complexity, I think is really important here. There are a couple of other points on. I really like that you picked up the point on ranking of animal feces, or the danger. I was wondering if you had discussions around taking it one step further as sort of an analytical framework for exposure pathways, and sort of picking up on this transformational WASH. As part of that discussion, we realized we might miss a lot of important pathways, and whether that is part of, but you have part of that answer, and I haven't been part of all of the discussion, so you might already have that as sort of a comprehensive framework. If government or an NGO goes into community and looks around, and what's the sort of framework that they would be using to identify contamination pathways as sort of the next step for the ranking of animal feces. And then the third point is a little bit on those. So the recommendation of multi-sectoral programming, I fully agree. We have had programming guidance for multi-sectoral and in programming and sectoral integration between WASH and nutrition for decades. It's mighty hard to do because it's different accountabilities, different budgets, different government ministries, and getting them to work together is a big challenge. So while I agree, I'd say like this is how do we do that practically? I think that's the really important question that should be answered, needs to be answered, and I don't think there's an easy answer for that. So yeah, that's sort of the 3 point, sort of the behavior change, like an analytical framework, and then the multi-sectoral programming. Sorry that the mic didn't work initially.
No, I'm glad we got those comments. Thank you so much. That's really helpful, and we've taken note of those. So as we revise these recommendations, we'll be sure to think through those a bit more and change the language a bit, which is excellent, especially around that message transmission thing, softening that a bit and changing it to the overall behavior change idea. Great. Well, we definitely want to keep this conversation going. What we're going to do now is we're going to break into groups. And so we'll have 3 breakout groups discussing each of these recommendations. We've only got about 10 or 15 minutes, but we think if we break, we'll be able to have a bit more detailed conversation on each of those areas. And so please do, we'll open the breakout groups and choose a group. We'll have one, like I said, around implementation, one around advocacy recommendations, and then the research and monitoring group will stay here in the main room. So you should see join a breakout room. If you don't, hit those 3 dots on the bottom that says more, and then click join breakout room. And you can choose either advocacy or implementation, or like I said, if you want to talk about the monitoring and research, please just stay here and don't join a breakout room. So you got about 10 or 15 minutes, and Christy will call us back once that's done. All right, great. Well, hopefully those conversations were good. They certainly were in the implementation group, and I've got lots of notes from my team. I think I'm looking at the clock. We only have about 6 minutes left, and so I think it's best to just combine our last 2 thoughts here. So we have collected those key thoughts you shared. If there's anything that you wanted to say that you didn't get to say in the group, please do email us. We are looking to improve these recommendations, and once we do another edit, we're likely to share out just to get final thoughts and feedback before we finalize. So in our last 5 minutes, I think just would love to have the conversation of anything that wasn't said that you wish you could have said. Now is the time, but also the who question. We wanted to spend some time thinking about who do we imagine would take these recommendations and do something with them? Do we want to make sure they're targeted to a specific group or a specific person? We don't just want to make these and say that was a great conversation and go on from there. We want to make sure that the people who might want to or be able to implement these actually do. And that's not something that Clean, Fed, and Nurtured on our own, or PRO-WASH or WASHPaLS can do. So would love just to open the floor for thoughts on, once these are done, what conversations should we have and who should we target with them?
Peter?
Yes, Sam, go ahead.
I have a concern with the bullet 1 of monitoring research recommendation. They said define minimum standard for early learning centers that include standard for WASH infrastructure and so on. These early learning centers don't include children from 0 to 3. That's my issue. How are we going to factor those tranche of age in our monitoring system? That's the first feedback I had. The second is about your question right now. Who should be the owner, or who should be taking this forward? I think at the Global Center, it is our responsibility actually to think about this and integrate this in the core project model, in our WASH strategies, implementation strategies, including research and innovation, so that we can factor and consider all this in our next programming and our implementation.
Great.
Just
So from an
yeah.
So from an organizational level, for sure, at World Vision or at others, CareSave, to push this through towards kind of your umbrella body to make sure it gets implemented in projects. I think that's a good one, Sam. Other thoughts on key stakeholders?
I'm not sure if my other group members want to chime in, but we did have a good discussion around this who component in the advocacy working group, because, you know, coming from my own perspective, I have a very niche perspective in terms of like what I can come up with. But you know, I think it's important to use these global networks. So, you know, coalitions beyond Clean Fed and Nurtured, but then also, you know, some of these local networks or different coalitions, because those in itself serve as these coordinating mechanisms and already have all of these key stakeholders tied into that. So, you know, trying to reach out to those larger networks as well with some of these messages and key takeaways will be important after this series as well.
Great.
Wilbur, do you want to?
Go ahead, Julia.
Oh, Wilbur, do you want to jump in? I know you had a suggestion, at least for a next step of stakeholders.
Yes, one of the ideas we were discussing in the group was maybe submitting a to do a presentation or something like a poster at the UNC conference to kind of highlight the findings that we have come out, or the recommendation that we have agreed upon from this discussion series. So that's something that's on the table, and I think that it could also like help us either highlight what we've done, but also like maybe get more feedback, or get, you know, other people from the field to give us some what they think, and if they think this is a good approach, or like also maybe identify who the question that we have of who could help us move this forward. So that's something that we're considering.
Yeah. And looking at who's left on the call, I think everyone knows, but UNC this would primarily be a WASH audience, although it does pull in some other sectoral approach, because it's the Water and Health Conference, but it's primarily a WASH group there. And I mean, I endorse that. I hope we could get beyond a poster, just because it's something that really requires discussion, and so almost by definition, the posters aren't so interactive, unless of course it's like, I think last year they did actually have talking posters, they called it, where each poster person could do some interaction.
Yeah, I think we could. That's up for, you know, like we can all agree on what would be the best modality. But that was just an idea that I think
Yeah,
there's
no,
a lot of
I
different
endorse it. I
options.
just would like to at least try and have it be a session rather than a poster, just because it would invite more interaction. But yeah,
That's true. Do others have other thoughts on that? Because if we want to move forward with applying for the UNC conference, then, you know, we could draft something, and we need to submit it by by May 3rd, I believe. So I think that that's something that we have enough time to do. We just need to decide on like what how we want to present.
and then as far as other stakeholders, to bring it to where I sit, again, primarily from the WASH, with much more access to the nutrition. So for me, the ECD is I don't want to say the weakest stool. To me, it's the least it's the least accessible. And so I'd like to do sort of more, when we say who we bring this to, I think it's to vet some of this with all of the sectors, but particularly among ECD, to try and again, how to make sure that sort of those openings, they're from their perspective, that we're that we're presenting something that is viable and compelling. And even some, Sam, I think you were saying, focusing on early learning centers. Well, that's one, but that doesn't get the first 1,000 days for ECD. Playpens, that pulled in the ECD folks because it just jumping, but that gave something concrete to stand up on. So it was motor development. So it was, again, a concrete appealing thing. So I just want to make sure we do have that ECD representation in the stakeholders. Anything else? I'm mindful of time here, so I think unless there's something more compelling, if you want to bring us on this, well, the slide, it just. So again, I do want to wrap us up at this session, at this point in the session, with real thanks from Clean Fed and Nurtured, PRO-WASH, and the USAID WASHPaLS project for participation. And while we're dwindling as we sign off, but it's been really robust participation across the three and now this fourth session. So we all thank you for that commitment and that interest. And we will take these recommendations. We'll circulate the wider list to everyone and elicit some feedback as well in a written form. We'll follow up on the next steps, certainly of the UNC, and then some of these other sort of stakeholder reach outs. We'll review the notes for anything else as far as the next steps that we don't want to miss. And we thank you all. We'll reach out again through the mailing to see those who want to join the coalition mailing list, to be kept abreast of other kinds of activities. And then we'll be moving forward and looking for volunteers to try and develop some of these things that we've talked about. So with that, we'll close the session with great thanks and wishing you well for your weeks ahead. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks all.